Awesome. Thank you so much. So, yeah, today I'd like to talk a little bit about Tolkien's letters, how we know about them, what some of what they contain, and as a fan, collector, researcher, scholar, how to find these yourself and how to do additional studies and what is coming from there. But why collect, read, or study these? As a part of the theme of this seminar, the heritage of Tolkien, understanding what's thoughts were going through his mind at different points in time, different subjects he was interested in. The answers to these questions I have up on screen are probably as numerous as the number of people who are asking it. It's different for everyone. And one of the fascinating things about Tolkien is just the sheer number of letters that he wrote throughout his lifetime. As I go through this paper today, we'll talk about quite a number of them and about them a little bit. But the expectation and our knowledge of these is that we've only briefly cracked the surface of the sheer volume of letters that are out there in the world. Why, if you ask yourself, what could I ask Tolkien today if I'm reading about Middle Earth or if I'm interested in his views on any particular subject? My feeling personally is that there is likely a letter out there somewhere, whether we've discovered it yet or not, that touches on that subject. So this is the why. But for today's presentation, I'd like to spend more time on the how. We know these letters exist. We've seen some of them. Some of them have been published, but the finding these letters can be quite challenging. There's very few of them that have actually been published in Carpenter's books, for example, and discovering which letters might be interesting to the topic that you are doing research on can be quite challenging. And so that's the how that we're focusing on. They appear in archives. We, of course, know that there's a few significant archives. There are some that show up in auction catalogs, dealer publications, fanzines, books, newspapers, magazines. They are distributed across an incredible range of sources, and being able to discover those letters, what you're interested in, and where to find them has been a challenge. So today, yes, what do we know about those letters, and how can we learn more, and what is interesting in those? So starting off, a large reason why we know a lot about Middle Earth beyond the published books is he was a prolific letter writer. He answered letters from fans. He started doing this in 1937. He got a fan letter from Arthur Ransom right after The Hobbit was published, and he responded to it. You can see a portion of that in Carpenter in letter 19. So immediately after publishing his first work of his first book in Middle Earth, The Hobbit, he was receiving fan mail. And moving on from there, even before The Lord of the Rings was finished, he was getting significant numbers of letters asking questions about the contents of the book and when the next book would be coming out. Those never let up. He ended up receiving, according to Joy Hill, in 1970, he was receiving 200 letters a week of fan mail that was coming in. He did try to respond to many of those in the early years, and when you got to the later years in the late 60s and 70s, a significant number of them ended up being secretarial letters, just thanking for the fan for writing, but not providing any additional personal information from Tolkien himself. So one of the primary sources from letters that we found in the 1960s is fanzines, where these fans themselves would write to Tolkien, and when he replied, they would publish that letter in the fanzine itself to share with their readers. The first one I've come across was in Trioed in May of 1960. On the right, you can see the cover or portion of the cover there, where Tolkien was responding to an article discussing how to cast a movie of The Lord of the Rings and what actors might be used in that movie, and he discussed his thoughts on filming a little bit. It was a brief letter, but from there, the I Palantir in '64. Tolkien Journal is an excellent source of letter information. I've put one sample up here, which is the 9th issue, the volume 3, number 3. But there were multiple letters or extracts from letters that Tolkien included in Tolkien Journal because he corresponded with the founder, Dick Plotz. We know of 7 letters that Dick saved that he received from Tolkien. So it was a long-lasting relationship that the two had, and there were some personal letters in there as well that did not get published in the journal. Moving on to Karen Daith, which contained another letter where Joy Hill quoted from Tolkien. Again, an interesting little snippet. In Vector, we received, Gene Wolfe received a letter from Tolkien that was talking about the etymology of a particular word. So there are these brief mentions that we see from Tolkien in these early fanzines where he was corresponding with fans who had innumerable questions about The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and Middle-earth in general. A large number of these letters were asking when the Silmarillion was going to be published. And of course, Tolkien's answer was always not yet, it's coming. And then later in his life, the answers were almost exclusively, I can't answer any of your questions because I'm focused on finishing the Silmarillion. After this brief exposure to the fact that Tolkien was writing letters, and very few of them were showing up in more public forums like these fanzines. In 1978, so after the publication of Carpenter's biography, the family gave him permission to work on a volume of letters. And as you can see here in this letter that was published in Amundsen 33 in 1978, Carpenter announced this and asked readers, members of the Tolkien Society, and others. He went public with this announcement, trying to find letters that Tolkien had written. The family and the publisher had significant archives of carbon copies and draft letters that Tolkien had saved when he was composing his letters, but the family and Humphrey knew that Tolkien had written a significant number of letters of which they had no record. And so Humphrey put out this request to people who may have corresponded with Tolkien, and he got a significant response. It took almost 3 years to collect these letters together and assemble them into what we now know as Carpenter's letters to J.R.R. Tolkien, which was published in 1981. Inside this book, we were given 354 letters, so significantly more than had been seen before in the brief fanzine mentions and elsewhere. A very large number of letters, obviously, that Tolkien had written. The focus was intentionally primarily on his early life and on his writings about Middle-earth, because that's what the publisher and the editors, both Carpenter and Christopher Tolkien, thought the fans would be most interested in. So they assembled, out of all the submissions, this collection of 354 letters. Some of them were complete, but many of them were lightly or heavily edited down. You can see sometimes in letters, you'll see ellipses, or you will see the lack of a greeting or a closure. which would indicate that the letters themselves had been edited down. If a letter shows up in this book that has the date and the greeting and the signature, the farewell at the end of the letter, it's likely to be more complete than the ones that are obviously just a few sentences or a paragraph and have been edited down for content or for space. The source of these is primarily from the family and the people who submitted the letters. One thing that's important to keep in mind is obviously only the letters that were known or had emerged in the 1970s were included in this book. And so obviously there are no letters in here that were discovered after 1981. The next source after letters was published is auction catalogs, dealer catalogs, and archives where donations of materials have been made or acquisitions have been made. The first auction that I'm aware of a letter from Tolkien was actually held in July of 1973. So before Tolkien had actually passed away, this letter was put up on the market and sold through Sotheby's. Since then, there have been many hundreds of auctions and dealer letters that have been sold. One of the primary ways new letters have been discovered or shown to us, to the public, is by donations to archives. I mentioned the major ones here, the Bodleian, the Wade Center, Marquette, but there are dozens of archives that have collections of letters from Tolkien and other materials. And throughout the years, I know certainly for Marquette, they've actually spent money to try and grow their collection. That's not as common these days as it was back in the early days of building the collection out. But the recognition that these letters were important and needed to be archived and studied to understand Tolkien better has been recognized really since his passing, and even before then. If you look at the Marquette's purchasing of his manuscript material for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The letters themselves add a significant amount of context to his other published writings. Unfortunately, to those who want to study his letters, most of them have been purchased and disappear into private collections. And other than the brief mentions or extracts that we see in auction or dealer catalogs, we don't know the full content of that letter unless it reemerges or it's shared by the person who purchased it. But most of them do not ever get published. They go into a private collection and they are stored, and their location is usually not known, and they are not then published from there. One example I want to walk through, particularly in this, that I found very interesting, is the letter and associated documentation that Tolkien had sent to Mrs. Elgar. We know about this letter as number 255 in Carpenter's book, but that only contains 2 paragraphs that were discussing some of the background on the poem of Festiticolan, and that's it. But the actual letter itself is 2 pages long, and with it, Tolkien mentioned, as you can read here in the Sotheby's listing, that he was including a 9-page handwritten manuscript, which was concerning the poem The Hoard, and it went into significant background of the Silmarillion and how it associated. So this was sent in 1964. It had a significant amount of material in it about what wouldn't be published until after his death in the Silmarillion, almost 2 decades later. When this auction took place, you can see the estimate was £2,000, which is about what it sold for. At that point, it was bought by a dealer, and that dealer then sold it to a private collector, and it disappeared in 1984. Other than this auction listing, and along with it was a picture of the kinship of the half-elven, sort of a family tree, which unfortunately I can't reproduce here in this talk, but it is available to see if you go looking for it. The discussion, especially, for example, Nancy March and Christina Scull and Wayne Hammond had some writings about this in Beyond Bree in 1985, where they shared their interest in the material and unfortunately did not acquire the material. And so it's been sort of this rumored document that's been known about, but the contents were not known until it's about 2 years ago. A few people were doing research and discovered who bought it, the name of the person who bought it from the dealer. The dealer's catalog listing was became available. That gave the name of the collector who had bought it. When that family was contacted to ask if they still owned the document, they did not reply, but then within a few months, it was listed again up for auction at Heritage Auctions. And it sold in 2022 for over $150,000. So it's, and the nice thing, what was incredible that came out of this experience was when it was listed in 22, the auction listing actually included a full reproduction of the entire document. So anyone who looked at that auction listing now knows the contents of the full 9-page document and the 2-page letter. It's a fantastic example to me of being able to read really important information that's been known about but not understood for decades because a letter showed up at auction, because it emerged back into the public eye, even briefly. We don't know who acquired it and where it is now, but now the contents are known, and it's very important to compare what Tolkien was thinking in 1964 versus what Christopher then published in 1977 in the Silmarillion itself. After auction catalogs and everything, Wayne Hammond, with the assistance of Douglas Anderson, did a really incredible amount of work putting together the bibliography. He published this in 1993. And one of the sections in the book is the published letters, which collects information and documents the places where letters are published through 1992 outside of Carpenter's book. Carpenter's book is obviously very well documented in here, but there are 88 other publications that are listed in here, identifying what letters were known at the time, which catalogs they were in, and it was a significant help to understand what people knew about Tolkien's letters in the early 1990s. Following on from that, in 2006, Christina Scull and Wayne Hammond's Chronology is an incredible resource for more of Tolkien's letters. They were given unprecedented access to archives of the family and the publisher, and able to put together a detailed list of what Tolkien was working on, and letters themselves are mentioned in here and what topics they were on and who they were written to. So this was a landslide moment in understanding Tolkien's letters, because there's well over 1,000. We haven't finished counting them and documenting them all at this point, but the sheer volume of letters that are documented in Chronology, and many hundreds of which are not documented anywhere else. This is the first time the public became aware that these letters existed and who he was corresponding with. So it was a very important addition to our knowledge of Tolkien's letter writing. So based on that, in the early 2020s, a team of us started working on the guide to Tolkien's letters, where we wanted to, in a single location, document what letters are known, where they're known from, what topics they're written about, and where you can find more information about them. It was a primary goal of ours to be respectful to copyright and permissions. So there's no letters themselves that are published in here that are from Tolkien. That's not the goal of the guide. The guide is meant to be a utility for working towards understanding what Tolkien wrote and where you can find out more about it, and point people towards the appropriate resources for doing further research. The archives they're held in, which auctions, when they might have come up. It's helpful for collectors when you're looking at what pricing might be if you're deciding to acquire something yourself, or if you just want to read the letters. There's indications on where the extent of information that we know for the contents of the letters, so you can do more study and pursue that. After launch, so in late 2023, the revised and expanded letters was published. It added 154 additional, some of which were not yet in the guide. So this was a significant addition to the knowledge base for the public on how many letters were out there. And it updated with additional material. 45 of the previously published 354 letters had material restored to it. A lot of people have wondered why they chose these letters and why the additional material was pulled in. This book is actually the original draft that Humphrey Carpenter and Christopher Tolkien had put together for the book, and they submitted it to George Allen and Unwin for publishing, and were told it was too long and needed to be trimmed back. So from the original draft, they then trimmed material, and the 1981 edition with 354 letters is what resulted. And at some point recently, the draft was rediscovered or reemerged from wherever it was being stored, and HarperCollins, with the permission of the family and the estate, decided to publish that. So it's an excellent addition to what we know of what Tolkien was writing. But again, it's important to note that these letters were what were known in 1981 or 1980, actually, before the book was published. So there's no new material in there that's emerged onto the market since 1980. You can see very briefly here, I know I'm looking at the clock, how the letters were distributed as far as what topics the new material and revised and expanded contained. They were pretty well distributed across content and decades throughout his life. One thing I wanted to briefly mention here that was very interesting was looking through what Carpenter edited, and we can tell that when a letter emerges on the market, the original, the actual documented original letter, and compare that to what Humphrey Carpenter published himself. In this case, there was a collection of 19 letters, 14 of them from Tolkien, about the early publishing discussions around the Hobbit from the 1930s, that was included as photocopies in a press kit that I ended up being able to acquire. Looking at that, I wanted to focus specifically on Carpenter's letter number 30. It's a very well-known letter. It's discussed quite often. I'm showing the first portion of it here. This is obviously where he's responding to the German publisher to say, thank you for your letter, but I'm not Aryan, and he has a very long tirade about that. But the important thing to note in the published letter is this ellipsis here, where material has been removed. Seeing the original letter shows that in this paragraph that was removed, that Tolkien mentions that he does understand why the publisher didn't like the translator he had proposed, but he would like, if they choose a different translator, to have the opportunity to comment and make suggestions before they move on. So this indicates immediately that he had been in correspondence with them before, and this was just a final detail in the contract negotiations that were coming through. But very interestingly, to me at least, the archive from the Blackwell's press packet also contained the letter from the German publisher that Tolkien was replying to, in which it said, there's an issue with the translation. We're not satisfied with it. the translation itself is correct, but it's lacking. It doesn't do more than a plain translation. Too much of the linguistic effect of the original is lost. That's a translation we've done from the German that they sent. So we immediately learned that there's a translation of The Hobbit into German that was done in the 1937 to early 1938 timeframe. That, from what we can tell, Tolkien had a friend do this translation. It was sent to the German publisher, and they didn't like it, and they wanted to choose a different translator. So that little ellipsis is hiding the fact that a translation of The Hobbit into German from 1937 exists. It's fascinating what little dots can hide somewhere in there. So we're not done. We'll never be done. There's more letters. We know of a large number of them that are coming. We have in the guide right now over 2,000 are documented, of which almost 1,400 are written by Tolkien. Of those 2,000 plus, more than 700, or I guess almost 700, are fully complete. We've seen the entire letter, and we know the entire contents of it at this point. And we have many hundreds more that we have in the queue that we're slowly adding to the guide. We've just launched the Father Christmas letters overview, talking about the different editions and where the letters can be found in complete transcript, and where the original manuscript forms can be seen, and which editions contain which letters. There's fantastic new books coming out that have material from Tolkien's writings, for example, on the Chaucer work that he was doing, and John Bauer's fantastic research into those. Part of which we understand because the letters that Tolkien wrote and show up in those books. And of course, to close out, as always, there's so many more letters out there, and it's a team effort, and having the help of all of you who are discovering letters or more information. We always appreciate the help, and we love what we do, and we hope that you will be able to find it useful and helpful. So thank you.
I'm waiting for Will. Thank you, Jeremy. We love what you do as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this incredible insight, Jeremy. And even then, just that kind of indication of what they left out was actually of its significant worth. So it, just imagine 20, 30 years time potentially, if we get an expanded edition, just what would actually be revealed.
Yeah, of the I think I've seen about 30 of the 354 letters from the original edition that I've now seen myself in manuscript, like the original letter, and almost 80% of them are different, have I'd say more than 70% have significant material in them that did not get published. So I'm hopeful that it's even for letters we've known about since 1981, there's still significant new material that will hopefully emerge as time goes on.
Yeah, it does seem to be kind of the further along you go as well, we'll end up with multiple volumes. But like, from my own field with romanticism, I know that Keats's might be one volume, but Byron's Letters and Journals are 7 volumes from the 1980s or the 1970s, I want to say. So it will only continue to grow.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the more we learn about his letters, the more further behind we are. it's each discovery makes it very clear how much we don't know, and how much more is out there.
Yeah, it's kind of similar. Even there's speculation, even after Hammond and Scull have delivered 3 volumes of his verse, we know that there's still so much more.
Yeah,
hasn't seen the light of day yet. So just got to keep on going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
I would love to see a volume 2. I think there's plenty of material to do at least 2 or 3 additional volumes if and when the family feels it appropriate.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hopefully sooner rather than later, in that instance. But if you do have a question for Jeremy, then please do use the Q&A. I'm aware you might be typing one at the moment. I'll just give you a second or two in case you are.
Tim maybe left already, but he commented in chat that it is impressive the amount of work the fandom does, including you and Tolkien Guide, to make the research and understanding of Tolkien, to promote it and like make it possible. So yeah, that is impressive, and that is why fandom is so important in keeping any heritage alive. So, like official institutions and scholars in academia wouldn't be able to do that by themselves, basically.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, the fact that has been so interesting to people to try and understand, even from the 1930s when he was responding to Arthur Ransom's fan letter through today. It it's an unprecedented glimpse we get into the mind of such a great author, that it was so well documented. He wrote all this down. He saved so much material. Other people saved it. And so many letters show up because the family held on to it for 50 years. It was important to them then, and it's even more important now to kind of flesh this out, that the heritage of Tolkien and the understanding of how he thought and how he wrote is very rare to have this glimpse into an author's mind.
It's interesting as well. So it's something that I've kind of thought a little bit about recently, how with the move towards technology, texting, email, social media, but then thinking about, well, hypothetically, if Tolkien was working at the moment, you might potentially have interviews with him on YouTube. But again, that's very very public. We may not have instances of this with current living authors of collected correspondence. So to be able to have an opportunity to be on such a personal footing with Tolkien seems quite rare in the current age.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so I can't see any questions.
There was something in chat.
Chat?
Yeah, some.
Thanks so much. Great session. It would be interesting to know what was the biggest surprise for Jeremy as he did his letters research, please. Thanks again.
So, I've touched on one of the biggest surprises was the 1938 German translation of The Hobbit that we've never seen. I doubt we'll ever see it, but the fact that one existed, and Carpenter obviously knew about it. He edited that paragraph out of the letter before they published it. Why was it edited out? What was was that a can of worms that the publisher just didn't want to have discussed? Obviously, the rest of the letter was pretty hefty material, him talking about, Judaism and Aryan background, and it wasn't a lighthearted letter that they just decided to make some edits to it. From that, the fact that Carpenter's books are a fairly heavily edited view of the actual letters themselves. Like, you look at auction listings and things like that, you see the letters, it's pretty much a direct transmission from Tolkien's hand to your eyes when you're seeing an original letter. And I, for decades, assumed that Carpenter's book was the same thing. And then when you start seeing the original letters and you're like, there was a lot that was changed in here, not removed. There's nothing nefarious about it, but it's a clear indication that what gets published and what the author wrote goes through an editing process. And obviously Tolkien had passed away. It was through Christopher's guidance and Humphrey Carpenter's hand, and then obviously Rayner Unwin had input at the time. So those letters that we've seen and taken as Tolkien's writings has gone through 4 hands or more before we get to read them. And it's just something to keep in mind as you're looking at any of these. And similarly with his letters himself, he may not be writing what he actually thought directly. He's filtering his own letter writing to the audience, to who he's writing to. So he might mention the religious background that's underlying the Lord of the Rings to a priest or someone else in a religious order, and he might talk about there is no religion and it's secular when he's writing to a fan somewhere else. And does he hold both thoughts? Obviously. I mean, he wrote them, he was being honest, but each letter by itself is not a golden standard of exactly what Tolkien thought. You have to take it in context with all of his other writings and when it was written and who he was writing to. So it's a learning experience to go through and see, you know, all the thousands of letters at this point. So it's so much fun.